Explain to me what the Jazz are doing.
And no matter what they've said to other teams, no one has ever not believed they were going to trade both of them if they could. I mean, you're not going to trade them for nothing. And now they want a giant haul for Donovan Mitchell.
Yesterday, you may have received a piece of groundbreaking information straight to your device. Especially if you happen to frequent Twitter, you may have seen that a brand new NBA superstar is available via trade. And this is significantly more substantial than the other superstars available via trade because this superstar is still in his prime, has yet to even see his prime. But if you were subscribed to this channel and you had our notifications on, then you would have known that this was probably coming. And not to say that I predicted this perfectly, but you didn't necessarily need to be some sort of genius to realize where the Utah Jazz were headed. Now, that's not to say that a trade is definitely going to happen, so I'm going to go and break down every little bit of this drama that you need to know, the top players for this trade candidate, and the likelihood of it happening. Before we get to the content, we just started a brand new TikTok page, which is the same handle as my Instagram page. We upload 1-minute shorts of this content, of this news, onto both of the platforms. Make sure you check that out. And now that we get all that out of the way, cue the intro. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? The Utah Jazz, man, have been in headlines a lot this offseason, whether it was from the Brian Windhorst meme saying what the hell is going on in Utah,
Why would they do that?
or down to the fact that the Utah Jazz have made several moves that have the implication that they are rebuilding. I mean, when a team is 2 years removed from being the top seed in the Western Conference and then falls short of their expectations in not 1 year in the NBA playoffs, but the year after, and then in the offseason, the very first move that we see happening is their head coach, who is a very reputable head coach, might I add, Quinn Snyder, decides to step down. Then you could tell that something is going down behind the scenes, especially if this is a team with a duo that you could build around, which at the time, Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert was a team that you were able to build around. And while the Utah Jazz did have a lot of promise and, to be honest, made some really remarkable moves in order to get their roster into the situation that they were in to begin with, we all have to accept the fact that, especially now more than ever, with the return of the Golden State Warriors and the Los Angeles Clippers looking to get Kawhi Leonard back and the emergence of the Phoenix Suns, the Utah Jazz of last year and the year before don't necessarily have enough to compete in the Western Conference, especially if they want to represent the Western Conference in the NBA Finals. And I think it takes a lot of maturity and honesty with oneself to come to terms with that the core of Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, having Mike Conley in there, having a pretty deep bench that featured defending sixth man of the year Jordan Clarkson, having a remarkable two-way talent in Royce O'Neal, and a very complex offensive system that is ran by Quinn Snyder that reminds us all of the motion offense that Greg Popovich used to run in the early 2010s. The foundation was there, but it clearly wasn't enough to contend in the Western Conference, and the Utah Jazz realized that. Now, they realized it at the most opportune time because there were already some signs slipping through the cracks between Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert. These two were subtly exchanging jabs with one another ever since Rudy Gobert touched the microphones right before the coronavirus pandemic. And although once they returned, business started to be booming. I mean, again, they did end up being the best team in the Western Conference, not last season, but the season prior. But here and there, you would get a subtle reminder that these two star players, one, don't really like playing with one another. There was the famous stat that Donovan Mitchell averaged 2 passes a game to Rudy Gobert. But two, this clearly wasn't enough to win an NBA championship. And a team that was in this exact same same situation a little bit over 3 years ago was none other than the Oklahoma City Thunder. And you got to give Sam Presti, who I think is the best general manager in the entire NBA, proper credit where credit's due. I mean, this man did absolutely everything possible to build a contender in OKC during the 2010s. Obviously, he was handicapped to a specific extent because ownership forced his hand when he was told that he needed to choose between Serge Ibaka and James Harden back then. But when Kevin Durant left, it didn't take Sam Presti very long to begin rebuilding around Russell Westbrook. I mean, very soon after, he was able to swing a trade for Paul George. At the time, we thought Paul George was going to be a one-year rental. He was able to get him Carmelo Anthony as well. Ultimately, although the OKC Thunder made the right moves, and although they were placed in a situation where, yeah, they would be able to at least make some noise in the Western Conference playoffs, clearly this wasn't a team that was going to win a championship. Not with the Kevin Durant-led Golden State Warriors representing the Western Conference. Sam Presti didn't go into the 2019 offseason thinking that he needs to blow up Paul George and Russell Westbrook, because in that situation, your hands are kind of tied. What Sam Presti did get was an offer that he couldn't refuse for Paul George, where the Los Angeles Clippers were essentially given an ultimatum by Kawhi Leonard, which, remember, this is when Kawhi Leonard was at the apex of his powers. This man was literally a few days removed from being traded to Toronto, which everyone thought was essentially Greg Popovich sending Kawhi Leonard into exile and then leading Toronto to its only NBA championship. And when Kawhi Leonard went to the Los Angeles Clippers, who by the way were trending upwards as well, they definitely gave the Golden State Warriors a huge fight during the 2019 NBA playoffs in the first round, behind the likes of Lou Williams, Danilo Gallinari, Montrezl Harrell, and Patrick Beverley. Eventually, the Los Angeles Clippers were so hungry for a star player to be able to build around moving forward, a reason to give additional Los Angeles fans to root for them that weren't busy rooting for the LeBron James-led Lakers, who were coming off of their own horrible season, and eventually decided that it's worth giving up 5 first-round picks and Danilo Gallinari and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in order to get Paul George, because this was essentially a trade for Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because the Utah Jazz appeared to have already had this plan from the moment they entered the offseason. I mean, the very first move they made, well, not a move they made, but the very first transaction we heard was Quinn Snyder stepped down. Following Quinn Snyder stepping down, we heard, and this was kind of something that slipped underneath the cracks because it was right before the biggest trade demand in the entire NBA offseason, the Brooklyn Nets traded a first-round pick to the Utah Jazz for Royce O'Neal, which one shows you that the Brooklyn Nets are still trying to compete, but two, it shows you that the Utah Jazz are committed to a rebuild. Very shortly after, we heard of the Rudy Gobert trade, where the Utah Jazz traded a 30-year-old Rudy Gobert to the Minnesota Timberwolves and received Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, Leandro Bolmaro, Walker Kessler, Jared Vanderbilt, and 4 future first-round picks and a pick swap. That is an offer that you cannot refuse. Very shortly after, Donovan Mitchell went to the Utah Jazz and said, guys, what's the plan here? You know, you hired Will Hardy, which I personally love the hire. I think it could definitely go really, really well. But you traded my co-star. We have a bunch of first-round picks in the future. But by the time these players develop, there's a chance Donovan Mitchell isn't even on the roster anymore. So Donovan Mitchell has questioned the moves that the Utah Jazz are making. And we even said that the Utah Jazz have 2 roads at this point. One being that you do your best to build around Mitchell with the additional capital as soon as you can, maybe use that capital to trade for another star, and hopefully you're at a situation where you're contending by the 2024 to 2025 season because Donovan Mitchell can opt out following that season. By then, Donovan Mitchell would be 28 years old. So the other option is a fairly straightforward one. It's to trade him. But it seems like the trade market has been relatively slow so far. I mean, Kevin Durant has been available for trade. Kyrie Irving has been available for trade. Why isn't isn't anyone trading for them? Well, Kevin Durant's 34 years old. Kyrie Irving is 30 years old, and with all due respect, there's no guarantee that this man's going to play basketball for you. Where Donovan Mitchell is completely separate from Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant is the fact that this man is still a month and a half away from his 26th birthday. He's still under contract for 3 more seasons past this year, and his team appears to be headed towards a rebuild. So when we got the notification from Adrian Wojnarowski yesterday saying that after previously shutting down inquiries on moving all-star guard Donovan Mitchell, rival teams say the Utah Jazz are showing a willingness to listen on possible trade scenarios, we weren't necessarily very surprised by this. It's pretty much like, hey, I know you're looking at Kevin Durant, but you could have Donovan Mitchell, and we probably just want something in the ballpark of what we received for Rudy Gobert. The asking price, according to Woj, appears to be steep, but in the wake of Utah's recent Rudy Gobert blockbuster deal to Minnesota, the Jazz are no longer simply dismissing calls on Mitchell, sources said. Now, Utah Jazz general manager Justin Zanuck told reporters in a recent interview, change is inevitable in the NBA. Things evolve in the NBA, so I couldn't sit here and say anybody is untouchable. There's no intent there to trade Donovan Mitchell at all. So the Jazz are open to trades across the entire roster too, but Mitchell is certainly the organization's most valuable and coveted asset. So like we were getting from Brian Windhorst, something is going on in Utah. It's not like they're upset with Donovan Mitchell, but I said this right when James Harden was about to get traded to the Brooklyn Nets, when there were signs of Russell Westbrook being frustrated with the Houston Rockets. If you guys remember when we were making content on that following their experience in the bubble, I sensed the fact that there was an opportunity to trade James Harden before he gets frustrated. And don't get me wrong, James Harden's situation and Donovan Mitchell's situation are completely different because Mitchell still has his best basketball ahead of him, and in my opinion, I fully believe that, and he has significantly more years left on his contract. But the Utah Jazz were able to trade Rudy Gobert before things got tense with him and the Jazz, and maybe even Donovan Mitchell. And as a result, the value they got for him was remarkable. Now, I think in this case, all the Jazz are doing is saying, hey, you could have Donovan Mitchell. We just want you to give us a good return for him. And there are 2 teams that come to mind when it comes to a trade package for Donovan Mitchell. Originally, I wanted to make this video yesterday, but to be honest, my recovery has been a little bit rough, and I wanted to wait for more information to get out there so we could give you a more complete video, primarily because Jake Fisher has been emerging as one of my favorite analysts in the game. I mean, the NBA Insider game is definitely in good hands, but Jake Fisher says it beautifully here. First things first, no Donovan Mitchell deal is expected anytime soon, barring a significant offer that Utah would be forced to consider. Perhaps this dynamic will be similar to the Rockets' positioning during the final months of James Harden's tenure in Houston, when the Rockets turned down offers for PJ Tucker and made other moves to convince Harden to stay. Harden would later request a trade from the franchise before that year's deadline. I think the most important part of this article, and we'll link it in the description down below, you should definitely check it out, is what teams can actually meet the price of Donovan Mitchell. There are mainly 2 teams in my mind. The first one's a very popular one, and it's the Miami Heat. And Jake Fisher mentions that they have long been mentioned as one of the most eager suitors for Donovan Mitchell, but Miami also remains involved in the Durant sweepstakes. The Heat may not come away with either Durant or Mitchell, but they definitely can't steal both. Miami has been unwilling to propose a trade for Durant that satisfies the Nets' asking price because of the difficulty of the Heat also retaining adequate support around Durant and Jimmy Butler. And when you look at the Miami Heat, man, like, just think of what they could really offer at this point. I mean, yeah, you could dangle Duncan Robinson and Tyler Hero, and I mean, I don't think they're gonna part with Bam Adebayo. I don't think you could really make a very attractive offer to the Utah Jazz while maintaining the pieces that you need to compete for an NBA championship. That's at least in my opinion. On top of that, the Miami Heat have never been the types to offer a tremendous amount of their assets for a player that's disgruntled in their current situation. That's just never been their style. They usually just wait for players to get get very frustrated in their current situation, and when their value hits a fairly low point, they'll buy low on that player. So as I was editing this video, we got some breaking news that the New York Knicks and the Utah Jazz are actually in trade discussions right now. Now, I still think Jake Fisher brought some really good insight, so I wanted you guys to get an idea of what Jake Fisher says, and then we're gonna bring you guys the breaking news. You don't want to miss this. This is where it gets very interesting, and I wholeheartedly agree with this. The number one front runner to land Donovan Mitchell is the New York Knicks. Now, Knicks fans, you should definitely be a little excited about this because I know a lot of you guys have been frustrated based upon how your NBA draft has gone, but New York would seem to be the clear front runner to land Mitchell. The Knicks' interest in the New York native has been obvious for a while, best illustrated this past spring when members of the front office attended Utah's opening game of the playoffs in Dallas. And after a series of trades beginning on draft night, the Knicks are now armed with 11 first-round picks in the next 7 drafts, plus intriguing young talent that could suit Utah's rebuild. New York can offer some combination of picks, RJ Barrett, Obi Toppin, and Emmanuel Quickley, and that's probably the benchmark any team is going to have to beat in order to get Donovan Mitchell from the Jazz. Now, bear in mind, this all is based upon how much the Utah Jazz would really want RJ Barrett in return. And to be honest, RJ Barrett has been developing remarkably in the NBA so far. I mean, he just finished his first 20 points per game season. He's improving as a three-point shooter, although he took a little bit of a step back, but still 34% from three. But I think the most important part is he's improving as a defensive player. He was a huge liability in his rookie season. He's starting to get a little bit better on the defensive end, still a negative 1.3 in DBPM, but he still has a positive VORP, and there's still something there. I mean, he's 22 years old. He's still developing. Clearly, he's trending upwards at this point. On top of that, what is really interesting about this is if this trade were to happen, it means that the New York Knicks would have a backcourt of Jalen Brunson and Donovan Mitchell, which would be interesting. But apparently the reason they signed Jalen Brunson is they wanted a table setter and a secondary scorer like Brunson on the roster, which would be an attractive proposition for a potential top line player like Mitchell. So as I was editing this video, we got an official tweet from Shams Charania saying the Utah Jazz and the New York Knicks have started discussions on a Donovan Mitchell trade. Sources tell me and T. Jones on the NBA. New York has Utah's focus currently amongst interested teams. Now, this is stuff that we thought was quite obvious, primarily because the New York Knicks have the most assets to give to the Utah Jazz for Donovan Mitchell. So Utah Jazz and New York Knicks have begun discussions on a potential trade to send 3-time NBA All-Star Donovan Mitchell to New York, sources tell The Athletic. The Jazz are having conversations with multiple teams on a Mitchell deal, but the New York Knicks have emerged as the focused destination over the past several days, sources said. Both sides have discussed a deal framework in the past 24 hours, those sources have said. The Knicks possess 8 future first-round picks, 4 of them being their own, 4 being acquired via trades to use in a package. New York also has stockpiled young players such as Quentin Grimes, who is believed to be of interest to Utah. Sources say that the Utah Jazz have made all of their veteran players available in trade talks, and there are no untouchable players currently on the roster. Guards Patrick Beverley, Malik Beasley, and Jordan Clarkson have been pursued by teams across the league in recent weeks. Miami has also expressed interest in Donovan Mitchell, but has only 2 first-rounders able to be traded and a potential centerpiece in Tyler Hero, who is extension eligible. Because of this, the Heat would likely have to engage a third team in a trade to supply the Jazz with the draft compensation needed for them to feel motivated enough to trade Mitchell. In my mind, I think this trade is definitely going to happen way sooner rather than later, because typically the way these things work in free agency is if a team wants to make a big splash, the team that made said splash wants to understand what they should do next. Should they go ahead and sign some free agents? If you're the Utah Jazz, you're clearly committing to a rebuild. Maybe take on some low-risk, high-reward players that didn't have the best luck on their first team. If you're the New York Knicks, you would try to figure out the best pieces to build around Donovan Mitchell. And honestly, this just makes way too much sense to me for it not to happen, because the Utah Jazz would be getting what they would want, which is a tremendous return for Donovan Mitchell. The New York Knicks have the ability to give said return to the Utah Jazz, probably more so than any other team. I think the next couple of days is just going to be about what is just enough for the New York Knicks to give up without it being too much, and what will Utah accept. I give it about a week before we see Donovan Mitchell in a New York Knicks jersey. I could be wrong, so let me know in the comment section down below what you guys think about this. Do you think the Utah Jazz should trade Donovan Mitchell? Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.